This mini presentation will address the relationship between modality, pedagogy, and outcomes. There are several new vocabulary words that you should pay attention to throughout the presentation. I want you to begin by imagining that you're talking with a friend who begins to rant about how awful a course is that she's currently taking. She says the teacher just shows endless PowerPoint presentations, the class is boring. At the end of the rant, your friend says, I've just decided that classroom-based learning is just completely ineffective. How might you respond to this generalization? Might you say to yourself, I've had similar experiences, so I know that all classroom learning is awful. You might say to yourself, I've had some good and bad classroom experiences, so I know that classroom learning isn't always bad. You might say, my classroom experience has been always good, so I know that classroom learning is always good. Or might you say to yourself, it must be more about the teacher than the classroom environment itself. This leads us into our discussion about two major elements that impact learning in the classroom. One are the physical features of the learning environment, and the second are the pedagogical features that are used in the learning environment. Sometimes we refer to these as methods. The physical features might include things like modality, medium, technology, or classroom layout. Let's begin with modality. Modality is generally the term that refers to whether the course is online, or if it's face-to-face, or if it's a blend of the two modalities, which we call blended learning. A second area of the physical features of an environment is the medium, or the technology, the technological tools that are being used in that environment. This might involve reading words from a book, physical medium. It might involve using a whiteboard or a chalkboard. It might involve the use of radio or TV. Think, for example, of Sesame Street or other educational TV programming. It might involve the use of computers or mobile devices, or even as depicted in the bottom right-hand corner, it might involve learning through a futuristic virtual reality system. Finally, the third area of the physical environment that I want to talk about briefly today is the classroom layout. We know that there are many different ways to lay out a classroom to create the learning environment for the children, and these can have an impact on your children. You can have a row of desks where people are sitting in structured rows. You could have areas for games, for readings, for stations. So these are all aspects of the physical environment. So the three areas that I talked about for physical environment are modality, medium, and classroom layout. Now we're going to move on to the pedagogical environment. In the pedagogical environment, pedagogy is the methods or strategies that you use for teaching. There are general pedagogies that can be used when teaching any subject matter, or there are content-specific strategies and pedagogies that are used only within a particular subject domain. Some examples of general pedagogies include classroom management strategies, direct instruction, demonstrations, small group discussion, problem-based learning, practice with feedback. These can all be used regardless of the content that you're teaching. Some examples of content-specific pedagogies include things like doing a reader's workshop in an English language arts class, or mini documentaries and using primary sources in history, or using math manipulatives to teach digits, or science inquiry in a biology classroom. So the question is, which of these two has the most significant impact on student learning? The physical features, are those the most important? The pedagogical methods, are those the most important? Or are they both equally important? Research tells us that the methods, the pedagogy, or the pedagogical elements, have a direct impact on student learning, so they're very important. The research also tells us that the physical features or the medium of instruction does not have a direct impact on student learning. This makes sense if you think back to our initial example. When your friend says that the classroom instruction is ineffective, she's focusing on the physical features of the environment. We all know that you can have effective and ineffective instruction in the classroom. It's really about what the teacher does in the classroom that makes the difference, not that the instruction is taking place in the classroom. This same mistake is made all of the time with online learning. You may have heard someone say that online learning is not effective. The fact is that generally research has shown outcomes from online learning are just as effective as traditional classrooms. Some pedagogies used in online learning are not as effective, while others are more effective. Once again, it's not that it is online or face-to-face that makes the difference. It's what you're doing online or what you're doing face-to-face that makes the difference. It's also important to understand that the physical environment is important. It's not unimportant. The physical environment has an indirect impact on student learning because it influences the kind of teaching strategies or pedagogies that you can use in your instruction. The physical environment provides affordances and constraints to the methods that can be used to teach. For example, think of the affordances and constraints of different writing tools, from chalk to slate to pencils and maybe even keyboards, different tools that are used to write with. Each of these elements of the environment, of the physical environment, afford or allow certain kinds of activities, or they constrain and don't allow certain kinds of activities. I'd like you to see if you can think of some examples of affordances and constraints in the learning environments that you've been in, perhaps even this class. Here are 6 examples that you could think about. For example, each of these environments or each of these tools has different affordances and different constraints that enable or disable certain kinds of teaching. For example, a science lab. You can do things in a science lab that you can't in other places. How about a classroom that has a set of iPads for all the kids, or a classroom with interactive whiteboard? How about a classroom where you have a set of manipulatives that the kids can use for math instruction or literacy instruction? How about an environment that enables video-based conferencing or text-based discussion? All of these environments, all of these tools have affordances and constraints that enable and constrain the kinds of teaching that you can do. So, back to our initial example. When you think about traditional online and blended learning environments, I hope that you'll focus deeper than just the physical or surface features of the environment. Ask yourself, what teaching practices or pedagogies does the environment enable? And what kinds of strategies are limited or constrained by the environment? Finally, in this brief presentation, you've been introduced to some new vocabulary that you should be familiar with. If you do not know what any of these terms mean, you should go back and review different sections of the presentation.